Absolutely,
Hey,
absolutely.
hey, all right. We're doing this impromptu Zoom conversation because of these uh, recent Atlanta massacre is what some people are calling it. It's still early stages development on this, but uh, we wanted to quickly add some words, and I know Joe a little bit, and we're not even super close friends, but I just feel like a need to respond, and Joe as well. So I'm going to share who I am really quickly. If you're watching this, it's probably on our social media, so you might know one of us. I'm Jeremy Chen. I am involved in ministry in North Philadelphia, um, uh, Christian minister, and I'm not involved mainly in Asian American or Asian Christian circles, but I have interfaced with many Asian Christians over the years, but I'm deeply concerned about helping facilitate work on better relations between Asian Christians and especially other people of color, especially Black Christians. So that's one big project that we're trying to kick off in collaboration here in Philadelphia. So that's one thing, but in the same week that we start connecting dots between some leaders here in North Philadelphia about Black and Asian Christian collaboration is when yesterday or the day before, this crazy shooting with this 21-year-old white man, Christian. So I'll leave it at that. Joe, who are you?
Yeah, I'm Joe Kim. I'm the English ministry pastor at Emmaus Ministries in Queens, New York. And I've known Jeremy, we knew each other from seminary. And I serve primarily in Korean American circles, but my denomination is like 95% white, and I'm heavily involved there. And my involvement in race discussions and racial issues, I've been on and off trying to serve inner city communities in West Philadelphia and Camden for the better part of 20 years. But everything came to a loggerhead when George Floyd was murdered. And there was something inside me during that time that says, I have to do something. We have to do something about this. And that started this serious, focused journey to try to learn as much as I could about what was going on, why did this happen, what were the conditions. And as I studied the Black experience in America, it quite naturally led to me wanting to learn about the Asian experience in America and how we experience racism and the like. And then when this thing happened, number one, just like I think all of us, right, in the Asian community especially, but everywhere, I think my heart broke. And there was something, it was difficult for me to process, right? So my typical way, I think a lot of Asians, our typical way of handling trauma and tragedy is we detach, we shut down, we try to maybe too quickly block it out of our minds, put our heads down and go forward. And I tried really hard not to do that. The reason I agreed that, we're talking with Jeremy here and talking about this topic is because I really strongly believe that that's not the answer. And that actually, I don't want to put the blame on us, but that might make things worse, especially in this current time where we have COVID and the anti-Asian racism that is rising by like hundreds of percentage points. And so that I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad that you brought this up.
Yeah, let me add to that. I mean, I think that's something that's really disturbing to me right now. Obviously, there's so many things you could talk about. You could talk about all the kung flu and I'll be open. I believe that Trump did sort of stir up the pot against, and especially in the last month or so, we've had explicit, very anti-Asian racist stuff. But like you right now, I think that's what I'm discerning is that I even had a friend reach out to me who is Asian American, very passionate about these racial issues. And she said, very similar response to me. And now you're saying it. And I think a lot of people, that you typically think that a community, when it comes to race and culture, ethnicity, whatever, that they would, when their own is hurt, that they would cry out. Right? When we think about, like, when we see that in the Black community, when you see that in the brown community, and but why is it that we detached, or that day when I saw that stuff, I was like, I saw the headlines, Twitter, whatever, and I just disengaged. I'm like, I gotta say, I'm not gonna look at it. I'm gonna leave it till later. I'm busy. There's a lot of stuff going on around me, you know, ministry. There's people hurting. There's suicidal thoughts, whatever. A lot of legitimate reasons. But I just, when George Floyd hit, I was fixated, right? So what's going on there? And I think that there's something, as I've been thinking about it, we're all in process right now, right? But one thing that's been thinking, I've thought about is external and internal. Let me explain that. Externally, I think, first of all, the whole thing that has been said by many, and if you're hearing this the first time, this is a thing, right? About how in conversations about race and culture in America, Asians don't know, both externally, people don't know where they fit, and internally, Asians oftentimes don't know where they fit. So if you, like those of us who do consider ourselves more racially aware, do lead in that and try to enter into the conversation and make space at the table, others don't know what to do with you. But you can feel like, am I crazy that I'm creating space at the table? So that's one thing. But just in general, people don't know how to process Asian stuff because we're exoticized, because Asian stuff is just too complicated. It's too out there for people. The cultural things to hang on Asian stuff is just, people are insecure about, am I racist against them? Are my stereotypes wrong? You know? And so they don't know how to categorize it. And so you're not seeing the kind of outrage or the cultural conversation. But on the flip side, with us, right, internally, that's the external angle. And internally, I think there is a sense of, you know, I think you were talking about how potentially, and this may be part of it, we're socialized to disengage our emotions, or not always engage with outrage or some of the more expressive emotions, just kind of trap it down. I think that may be part of it. But the other part is, I don't know. I mean, is it that we don't feel permission to be loud? Or it could be part of it, the Confucian thing is like, we're collectivist and sort of, you don't really, there isn't a ton of precedent within Asian American circles for the whole activist spirituality, for the marching, for the whatever. Just keep your head down and work hard, almost. And I'll confess this. Let me confess this, right? When this happened, some of the first thoughts were like, I don't even know if it's a thought, but as a general kind of vibe or feeling, was like, well, again, it wasn't a conscious thought that came to my mind, but it's almost like a sensibility that's like, oh, well, we can handle it. You know, we Asian Americans, that's just who we are. Or Asians, we just roll with it. We keep our head low. We work hard, you know, and we just kind of roll with it, and we don't always voice it.
Yeah, let me piggyback off of that. Okay, so I saw this video from the grandmother from Minari, right? That movie, the Korean American movie, and the grandmother was actually asked a question about Stephen Yoon crying over the Asian American experience, and they asked her about it, and she said she didn't really understand in the same way a second generation person would. Right. And the reason being is, when the first generation, we typically mean the people who think in Korean, they're from Korea, directly from Korea, and they tend to be older. Right. And when, like our parents, basically, when they came over from Korea, they had no expectation that anyone was going to help them. In fact, they really understood that everyone was going to hate them. No one was going to welcome them. They really thought that this was not just an uphill battle, but this is like a worst possible scenario, and they came anyway, right? So which means because they had no expectation, they developed this pessimistic view that they should just keep their heads down and keep working without complaining, because complaining wasn't going to do anything, especially if no one wants to listen and no one's going to help you. Right. But what the problem with that is that kind of seeped into various aspects. And again, I know not Asians are not monolithic. So you can't say Koreans are like Chinese or like Japanese. We all have our own stories. But I know in the Korean community, this was a huge factor that added to the model minority myth, right, which typically expects Asians to be that quiet, submissive, just deal with it, don't complain, and keep moving forward, right? And that seeps into us because it reinforces this inner voice inside of us that nobody cares, no one's going to help you. Think about this. This is an insight I was thinking about, that when we were younger, you would hear people make all sorts of racist comments against us. They would make, kung fu fighting noises, or all that. I'm not even going to dignify it with, and notice how all the anti-Asian racist things that people make fun of, they mock us, the sound, so on and so forth. There's no way to respond. There's no actual comeback, right? And so what's that? It's designed specifically to silence us. Yeah. So when you're in this kind of a situation, both from internally as well as externally, there's this drive to keep us silent, to force our heads to go down and let's just go on our way and pretend like nothing happened. And that's terrible. It makes it like almost I don't want to use negative words like that, right? But it makes it much harder to overcome.
Well, and yes, and so you're seeing, using the language that's often used, you're seeing it as a perpetual foreigner. Mm-hmm. Even if you grew up here, it's like, even though your parents, you already feel different than your parents, so you feel more American, and you feel disconnect from them. But then from the broader culture, you're seen as a perpetual foreigner, and you have to stay silent because there's no real, like you're saying, the things placed on us, there's no easy way to respond. And this is a structural reality, the fact that people don't know much about our cultures. It's not like, say, Hollywood or whatever, there's very few representation, which for me, it's a part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing. If we just had enough things in Hollywood, it'd fix everything. But part of that is that they don't understand our cultural stories, and we know it's too complex to try to even begin to educate. How do I begin to tell you what's the difference between Korean American, Japanese American, Chinese American, that's me, or even for when I try to start beginning conversations about Chinese and Taiwanese, and recognizing that our cultural stories are very complex, much more complex in some ways than many other people's cultural stories. And so because we know that on the other receiving end, it's overwhelming to want to receive that, and we seldom have anyone that actually cares to the level that they want to hear it. Yeah. So it's almost like whatever. So what's going on in your mind when someone's doing something racist is like whatever, So it builds up, and it's like whatever. Yeah. And we know the things that they racialize us in, what the mono minority, the perpetual foreigner, the sexualization, fetishization of our women. Yep. The viewing of men as passive and as unattractive and as emasculated. I mean, there's so many more things, right? And at the same time, you add on the layer these days, because I think you and I could both say that we're very critical at the same time of our own community. Absolutely. So you add in the layer of which we know the racism that exists within the Asian community, of the Black and brown community, and we know that there is socioeconomic considerations in here, right? Because oftentimes when you think about immigration, especially with East Asians, it was kind of the higher educated. And so we've into the model minority myth because you have such a high skyrocketing of socioeconomic mobility among East Asians. And so they, like every group, move out the hood, stay away from those who are poor. And that also translates into stay away from Black people, right? And so we see that in communities. Yeah. And we know that that's a problem. And so because of that, it's such a complicated conversation. It's very hard to know where to start. And there is a sense, and not to fuel the whole oppression Olympic stuff, but there is a sense in which we, at least from my perspective, there is merit to recognizing, look, our Asian American experience isn't the same as the Black experience, where you're just kind of like enslaved.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And all that. And so we recognize that it's very difficult to have those conversations, especially because East Asians tend to be doing relatively well as a block when it comes to socioeconomically. And so how to have those conversations, and I mean, there's so much here, right? It becomes very difficult.
Yeah.
And so people don't know how to look at us. I mean, I think people feel like they know how to look at Black people. They feel like they know how to look at brown people. They feel like they know how to look at white people in the broader conversations.
Yeah.
They just don't know where we fit in.
Yeah, no, definitely. Here, let me jump in on that real quickly. So I was thinking back to what I said earlier. If that's true, that the Menotti grandmother and her sentiments were like kind of, indicative of the whole generation, which I know is impossible, but let's just go with that for a second. It makes a little more sense why Koreans not just didn't, but had trouble considering the feelings and situations of other racial groups or ethnicities, right? So when they came over here, and then they're just, in their minds, they're just trying to live. And when people brought up the fact that their stores in the inner city, their shops and the like, their grocery stores, were actually making things harder for African Americans. It was hard for them to even hear the problem, because they came with the mindset that, well, everyone's against us already, and this is just yet another manifestation of that. Now, in my estimate, I've been, within the Korean community, that is changing. That I think there are more and more Koreans, Asians across the board, but Koreans specifically, right? Who, and I'm saying this because I agree, by the way, with the statement that we made life miserable for African Americans who are our neighbors in the city. I totally take that side, right? And so, but that's starting to be realized more and more. So like, as younger generations have conversation with older generations, the sentiment that this is true has come up, right? And there are actual, like, minds are being changed. And I think that's a fantastic thing. Secondly, our racism, anti-Asian racism, goes back 100 years, maybe even further. But when the Chinese first came to America, my understanding, sorry, my daughter is crying here. Hi, I'm right here. When the Chinese came over, my understanding was that the white people in San Francisco saw them as a threat to the economy as well as the social order. So one of the things they did was they forbade women from coming over, right? It was just men. And what had happened was the men came over, stuck their heads down, and got the work done because they needed the money. And so all these rumors about like Asian men being non-sexual, asexual, perhaps homosexual, right? And the stereotypes about our small genitalia. The goal was to not just emasculate, but to cause the Asian male to be a disgusting thing in the mind of white America, particularly women, right? And what it was it wasn't about sex per se. It was about power. It was about agency.
Always.
And that notion carried over, and it still pervades even today. It shapes our understanding of how we're perceived. And what's sad about it is, if you hear this all the time from every corner, so like you said, we have no representation in Hollywood. If we do have movies, Hollywood has a tendency to want to take our movies and our creative choices and kind of force us to let them tell our story, right? And what that does is that just reinforces these terrible stereotypes that we're only valuable if we offer sex. That's why our women are fetishized. If we're like good at like kung fu or something like that, right? If we're entertaining, it's really entertaining. That's why, remember how it was so hard for Asian men to find leads, which is, I'm glad that's changing, right? But before, you needed to be a comedian or a karate star, right?
Or the perfect intersection of a Jackie Chan, right?
Yes, exactly. And again, I'm glad that that's changing, but it's going to take a while, I think, before the attitudes against us change. And if you don't change those attitudes, you get what happened a few days ago, where this person can't see us Asians as humans. We're something to satisfy his sexual fetishes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Oh man. I mean, people have to learn. I mean, I think like, we all have to learn more Asian American history to know how this is related. And you went into some of that. I mean, you can talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. You can talk about, how Asian Americans came in. You can talk about the Civil Rights Act after basically that MLK and the whole movement opened things up that allowed Asian Americans in, and why Asian Americans need to recognize how they're indebted to the Black American struggle for even being able to come here. There's so many things we could talk about, but focusing on this shooting, right? I think we also have to, we're both followers of Jesus, and I think that we have to reckon with the fact that this was I think people are shy away from talking about race when they want to talk about unity. But I believe that unity comes through not from, sort of walking on eggshells around the truth, and so no true peace without justice, right? And so reckoning with the fact that this is a white man on the Southern Baptist denomination, which these days, if you're following any of the news of how Southern Baptist is processing things, and is connected to a pretty conservative movement within, I don't know if it's just within it, but it's called the Founders. And there, you can look these things up. Just how the way he processed his sexual instincts and, fetishization of Asian women. And then, it's like, I have to destroy the object. Like they're tempting me, And so, well, I have to destroy that object of temptation. It's like the guy that struggles with porn, right? And I've got to destroy the computer, right? And so it's like, no, maybe you need to learn how to have a healthier sexuality, and maybe you need to reframe your way of understanding and get therapy and all those kind of things. But these are issues that we're coming to see is a really, it's not a isolated reality in this subculture of Christian faith, especially here in the United States. You're seeing conversations emerge over the last couple months, right? January 6th, whatever, about white Christian nationalism. This guy talked about God and guns, the relationship to power is essentially the ultimately overarching thing, right? Of how we relate to power and learning to relate to others in a posture of ability to learn from others and not dominate. I mean, there's so much, but you think of it as just a neurosis, but when that neurosis actually creates harm towards others, right? It's not okay. It's not something that we can just kind of say, well, I mean, you have some reporters that are like, well, he just had a bad day, right? This guy just had a bad day. We need to look at him in this way. I mean, whoa, let's examine Christians. Let's examine our culture. Let's examine especially white Christian church, Southern Baptists. Are you going to own this? Are you going to allow it to be a kairos moment? Like that word meaning like a moment where you leave room for the Holy Spirit to examine and challenge you. I mean, I always go back to that verse that says judgment begins in the house of God, right? We think there's cultural ills out there. Are you allowing these moments to show you, wow, we are messed up. We're messed up. For me, I'm not a white Christian. I see some of the neuroses, but I'm not going to own that. I'm going to put it back as a mirror. Say, I think that there's some neuroses very clearly put on display here. Reckon with it. For me, I take the challenge to examine within our own experience as Asian Americans. Are we growing from this? Are we learning what we need to learn about understanding our own history, about understanding what functions in us that makes us have difficulty to have conversations and to invite people into conversations? So that's where I'm at with all this, man. It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. You mentioned a few things I'd like to touch on. Number one, purity culture has been an absolute disaster for not just Christianity, but for the entire world. Listen, and so
help us out with that language. So some of us might not be, purity culture has been a really challenging language to understand. Yeah. Help us out what you mean by that. Yeah.
Okay, so my understanding of purity culture is that they want to take certain notions of the Bible about sex and sexuality, right? And they want to reduce it to mere temptation, appetite, as if sex and sexuality isn't something created by God. And if and when it's created by God, it's only acceptable within the confines of marriage, right? Okay, so far, I mean, we can play around with it. Here's the problem, that the way that they tried to establish to keep people pure, if you want to use that language, which is horrible language, by the way, because purity in the Bible never meant sexual sin or whatever. It meant the heart that either was faithful, fealty, had fealty for God, or was somehow, there was something inside it where your heart is divided between your loyalties. Right. So a pure heart is one that is undivided in its fealty for God alone. But somehow we turned it to mean this sexual, are you clean or unclean? As if sex is this dirty thing, right? And what that ultimately did was it crippled people. It crippled our understanding of sex and sexuality, and it caused us to be unable to learn at what science taught us, so on and so forth. Let me give you just one example. Yep. So attachment theory is one of the latest things coming out of modern psychology today. And one of the findings was, if you do not have a secure attachment with your parent during childhood, you can consistently measure out the people that lack that to people who are always having sexual problems with their partners as adults. It's as if when you're having sex with your partner, you're looking to recreate, unconsciously, you're looking to recreate that attachment that you should have had as a child, but it's never going to come, right? And what that does is you'll have sex, but you will not enjoy it. Because your mind, your brain, your heart, let's use Christian language, your heart is looking from sex what it should have gotten from like your parents. And that's tragic. We were unable to even see that argument, let alone interact with it, so on and so forth, because we were so hung up on an overly simplistic understanding of sexual purity that may have been unbiblical from the start.
Right. And the stories that are unfolding is perhaps adding another factor here, right? If that fueled or that contributed to this young man's relating to his shame or whatever surrounding. Yes. Maybe he had a very bad porn habit. I'm assuming perhaps relating to Asian women or something like that, and the only way he knew how, trained perhaps.
Yes.
Or in maybe not explicitly taught by the church culture that he was in, but something that's not too crazy of his outworking of it to destroy that source of temptation or something like that. Or
So what happens is, as a Christian growing up in purity culture, I'm assuming that their church taught purity culture because we all did. Right. What that meant was he had no resources except for will alone, discipline alone. That's it. And you would say, yes, it's by God's grace. So you pray and you try to confess as much as you can. But ultimately, that method, sexual purity, the purity culture, demands discipline be the strength of what you do. And his urges were so strong he couldn't do it. And look at what he had. This is how he acted out on it.
So he's trying so hard, and then he do it, and then he fails, and it's like, he has to fix it through this kind of violent means.
Yes, because he has no in his mind, from a Christian standpoint, at least his version of Christianity, he has no alternative when there are multiple alternatives.
Yeah. Well, right? I mean, this is. I need to get deeper in this, and I think that. Honestly, it's an area too, when it comes to the Asian community also, in my upbringing, understand Asian Christian community. I don't think we have there's a lot of shame even around talking about sex and sexuality. I do think that in the broader Christian culture, to be able to have those conversations, which we recognize are very heated conversations in our cultural conversation right now, even without even bringing in LGBTQ issues. To be able to have those conversations and sort of take away the shame and make our natural human reality of we're sexual beings and needing to know how to channel that sexual energy, and that human desire in healthy ways, and in ways that God intended, and handle when we don't do it well. How do we just kind of repress, and then, or do we just kind of sink into shame, and then we have to find sort of very terrible outlets? And I think that's very, I mean, I think that's an insightful comment, or I mean, that's a lot even itself, as a topic.
Yeah, this is a huge topic altogether. There are all these things. It's a confluence, like all these things, and each and every one of them, kind of, you could do like a whole series of talks over, right? Because they're really that deep.
Yeah.
But they're all coming together into a loggerhead in this one situation.
Yeah. And I mean, what I want to see is more of these conversations. I want to see, especially Asian leaders. I mean, let me just do it here. If you're watching, you're an Asian leader, especially if you're an Asian Christian leader. I say that because we're both Asian Christian leaders. I challenge you, consider, how are you going to have these conversations? You lead other people. How are you going to have these conversations with others? Will you open up the conversation table without having the conversation? I'll say it this way. I think people are looking for it. People are looking for that conversation. If you're not doing it, they're either suffering in silence, or they're going to look for it somewhere else, and they may feel resentment that their leaders are not. I mean, there's so many ways that they could relate to it. And I think this moment when the cultural conversation is so lacking surrounding this moment, this shooting. I just think about when the guy shot up the synagogue. I felt like it was a much bigger cultural moment. The fact that it seems to me a blip on the radar for a lot of people. For me, tells me that we Asian Americans, I'm going to challenge us Asians. We may be socialized to have a difficulty to find our voice. It may be external too. Maybe other people make it difficult to desire our voice. Maybe we are unsure of our own voice, but find it, And that's why I think I want us that have moved forward ourselves, even in the process of finding our own voice, find your voice. I mean, it's not just about adding to the ruckus. I don't think it's that. I think that we have a cultural space that's void of the conversation that's very needed right now. And it's not just about everybody wants to have a podcast and talking heads. What it's saying is we need to steward our unique cultural experiences and help others enter into it to understand and learn how to participate in building common life together here in the United States. And it shouldn't have to be only responses to when some crazy sort of racist thing is shared out there, that these conversations, cultural conversations they're having. It shouldn't just have to be some violent episode or like Kung Flu or whatever that causes us to be curious about learning about each other's culture and learning about each other's stories and our collective stories as Asian Americans.
Yeah,
so that's my encouragement to others. I don't know if you have any kind of like sealing thoughts. I mean, this doesn't have to be the last conversation, but just any. Oh,
absolutely. So to follow up on that, I think when you use the term kairos, a kairos moment, right? So in other words, it's a time where we have to reevaluate everything. And it's important to do that. So I see a lot of progressive voices rising from our church, and I'm sure other Asian churches across the board. And what's happening is a younger generation is looking at a lot of the problems that we have going on with race, with economics, with injustice, and all these different things. Sex is a big one. And what happens is when we keep giving the same old answers that often sound like just some rote thing you're just repeating, probably because your tribe told you to say that, right? You don't want to anger the tribes, so you just get in line and you say what everyone else says, right? But unfortunately, a kairos moment means something is forcing us to rethink this and come up with our own answers. Like, what is it that's happening and how do we respond? And if we don't have these answers, just like you said, they're going to go somewhere else. And they might go to places that are actually deeply unhealthy and sabotaging in many ways. But the one thing that can't happen is it can't stay the same. So my urge would be, if you're a church leader or just a leader, period, right, in the Asian community, you need to think about these things. We need answers and we need leadership. And so if we just regurgitate the past, that's not leadership, because we're not taking seriously that Kairos moment.
And leadership is courageous and willing to shoulder the burden of asking hard questions and not knowing the answer yet. Right? I mean, you say that you had to learn a lot of, go on the journey. George Floyd, I mean, you're saying just in the last 9 months, that's a lot of work. And learning about Asian American history and learning about thinking through all these things, it may be intimidating. It may feel like I don't know where I'm headed, but that's, for me, that's leadership. Leadership is not just saying what everybody expects you to say. Yes, our Asian cultural heritage of collectivism, there's a lot of good there. There's a lot of good there. But when it becomes toxic is when we cannot have a self-correcting mechanism, when we cannot have prophetic leadership, when we cannot have courageous ability to lead, get a group to be uncomfortable, move towards better waters, better outcomes. And if the collective consensus ends up keeping us stuck and everybody's subconsciously looking around in the rooms like, we shouldn't say anything, and everybody's thinking the same thing, but we can't say anything, that's where it gets toxic. And I think that we all kind of know that this is a reality, right? We've experienced that. I've experienced what it feels like when I've been on this journey of trying to challenge our Asian American broader community and leaders to own their voice. And I sort of know, watch how I'm being perceived. And I have to ask myself, am I just arrogant? Am I just kind of, is that perception correct? Is it self-righteous, arrogant, speaking out of line, you don't know, you're not going through proper lines of authority, a lot of those kind of ways of thinking. But I've had to prayerfully discern, no, I think I have to do this. I think I have to move forward. And I think others are looking for this kind of voice and leadership, and they don't know it yet, and they don't know how. And you know what? I'm gonna say this last thing. I mean, when George Floyd happened, and I, as an Asian American, felt compelled to kind of speak out, and it kind of did just a couple ways of doing it, social media posts and like video response. What I found is that it seemed like there was a void there of Asian Americans speaking out too. But I would see people that I know are in spheres where there's other Asian Christian leaders and Asian leaders, and they would respond to me and say, "Thank you so much for saying something. We need that." And I was just voicing things that I thought were obvious. It's just kind of like, hey, we have racism in our community, right? Against Black people. It's like, could anybody seriously deny that? No, right? And I was like, we got to work on that. But the fact that people found it so refreshing for me to say that out loud, it's like, whoa, that's how silent we are. About our cultural experiences, about the race conversation, about reckoning with where we are.
Two practical ways to get there, semi-practical, right? For me, before George Floyd, racism was a hobby that I studied. After George Floyd, it became a mission. Until we get from hobby to mission, we're never going to be effective in terms, our effectiveness will be limited in terms of how we try to address race, right? Racism. And then the second thing is, I'm relatively conservative. I'm sure you know that. We've had many discussions on this. But the thing is, what I believe is that traditional Christianity, there's nothing wrong with being a traditionalist. The problem is we have to be able to take the tradition and be able to wisely use wisdom to bear on the current situation, right? So how do we use Christianity in our current state rather than regurgitate simply what happened in the past and let's just keep on going as if nothing happened? The first one will be helpful. The second one makes things worse. So we need to stop the urge to regurgitate And then we had to start exercising wisdom that I think Asians, each culture has their own perspective that would be helpful to the situation. We need to start using ours in gainful, helpful ways, not just for us, but for our neighbors around us.
Yes, 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 yes. You know, let me end the conversation this way. There's so many ways. I mean, this takes time to process, and we're going to be in lament. It's just a word of just grief, right? I mean, and I think it's appropriate, and I would suggest that people save space for that. But when you in moving forward, like it's holy work. The power of the Spirit is in this when you lean into it, and I have found God is fueling me for this. I found that God is giving connections, and I think that it's not just the latest cultural trend. It's not just kind of just trying to be woke or whatever. I believe that God is behind this because he desires reconciliation of all peoples, and he desires that we, as different kinds of people of different cultural, ethnic, racial, whatever backgrounds, learn to live together in harmony. And so, you know, I mean, let's lean into that. Brother, I learned a lot, so much from this conversation. I hope we can help with it. Look, Joe is a conservative, can I add, Presbyterian Reformed Christian. I might not be in alignment with Joe on everything. In fact, I know we aren't, but I can definitely say, look, if you're someone that considers themselves as part of that tradition, look to Joe for conversation. Joe, I think you'd be the first one to say you're not an expert on these things, but we want to move the needle forward. We want to move the needle forward.
Yes.
So, hey, everybody, thanks for listening to this conversation. Joe, any last thoughts before we end this video?
No, that's it. Let's do this again. And here, if I do have last thoughts, it's, gosh, I'm scared to death. I don't want to be that voice. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to be that leader. I know it's demanded, so I'll do it in so far as I can. But we need other Asian American leaders to rise up and stand up so that it's not just dependent on Jeremy or myself. Gosh, that'd be a scary thought, right? Yeah. But Asians are really good at collectivism. So a collective unity, if we have multiple voices who are better thinkers than we are.
Way better than us.
Even you, right? Yeah, seriously. Who we can come up with answers together, right? And that would be my hope. So I echo Jeremy's call to Asian American leaders to really join us, rise up, do your own thing even. We don't need to be the ones that say it, but someone has to stand. It has to start somewhere, and that's why I'm here. And I'm sure that's why Jeremy is as well.
Hey, man, Joe, thanks. I mean, we literally connected dots a couple hours ago and said, hey, let's just do this.
Yeah.
I'm thankful that we can get this conversation in. Again, maybe we can drop some links and stuff for suggestions for others to learn. But may God, let me just say a little benediction, all right? May God fuel these efforts by his Spirit, who raised Jesus from the dead, so that he can bring new life out of the ashes of this terrible tragedy that we're going to continue to grieve. So we pray these things in Jesus' name.
Amen.